Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
We will return, I think, immediately to the conversation that Nick was just conducting regarding this report by the think tank Quilliam into grooming gangs and the hideously disproportionate representation of British Asians in this kind of criminal activity. Just to get something up there early doors. I've been talking about this since it first appeared on the news agenda. We were talking about it in the most bold of terms long before the rest of national media got involved, and it's never led to me being accused of racism. I understand where that fear comes from, and having read all of the relevant reports into the crimes that occurred in the north of England, I understand where that accusation kind of holds true, but it's perfectly possible to do this without falling into that trap. The thing that occurs to me, and this is the thing I think that distinguishes this particular crime from a lot of others, is it's always been the gang element of it. That's the thing that I'm afraid, however uncomfortable it is for some people from a similar background to hear, that's the thing that seems to me to speak to background. You know what I do for a living. Essentially, the hardest bit of the job is finding the question that allows us to have a conversation that is illuminating and educating. The more you understand, the closer you will come to finding solutions. And we tried to get the right question. The racism element comes into it if we wanted to just pin it down immediately. The race element could probably be best proved by, if you have a little look at social media, the fellow running for the Senate in Alabama, Roy Moore, accused of molesting 14-year-old girls, queuing up to accuse him, and the same sort of people who profess to be really concerned about Asian grooming gangs in the north of England, the same kind of social media warriors who apparently care hugely about the abuse of young girls, are quite comfortable voting for or cheering along Roy Moore, who is accused of molesting 14-year-old girls. So that's where the racism fear comes from, for anybody who genuinely doesn't understand that. I'm not sure that there is anybody who genuinely doesn't understand it. I think a lot of people pretend not to understand it because they want to retain the right to care passionately about brown pederasts while turning a completely blind eye to white ones. That's not going to happen here. But the question that unpacked this story for me right at the very start, when Andrew Norfolk of the Times first started reporting on what were at the time a little more than rumours, was this question. I can't imagine ever being told by someone I know that he had successfully groomed an underage girl and was inviting me to join in the abuse. That's the point that I always think and have always thought speaks of what word you want to use, cultural or geographical or social similarities between these offenders. Because, I mean, you know, we've mentioned both of my schools a lot over the years, although oddly I've spoken a lot more about abuse by grooming gangs, Asian grooming gangs in the north of England than I have about abuse by Roman Catholic monks in my own schools. But they were all operating in isolation. So that there is something about the grooming crimes that demands a specific treatment. You can't just lump it in with all other child sex crimes. And while I understand the huge frustration that people of Asian heritage must feel at the kind of subtext to a lot of the coverage, which is that you're all dodgy. Look, we found some dodgy ones. That proves they're all dodgy. I am afraid I can't get past that notion of cooperation. That's the point, isn't it? That's the point about a grooming gang as opposed to an individual paedophile, is that these men, and it was interesting to hear one of Nick's guests, the fellow that used to head up the CPS in the north of England, is responsible for bringing an awful lot of these scumbags to justice. Also happens to be a Muslim, of course, but it's not fashionable to suggest that kind of proves that this has nothing to do with religion and something instead to do with a sort of social background, if you will. But he was fascinating, talking about it being part of the nighttime economy. And again, that, when you look into this, becomes as problematic as it is illuminating. You're talking about underage girls acting as if they were overage, hanging out in the middle of the night, being the worst one we heard, I think, 6 months ago, was a 14-year-old girl drunk in the street outside Tesco's at about 11 o'clock in the morning and being picked up by a minicab driver who subsequently groomed her and passed her around his friends. These stories all have a similarity, but the hugest issue for me, the point that I don't think anybody can get past, whatever your background, wherever you're from, is the fact that these men know that if they tell their cousins or their colleagues or their mates what they've been up to, their cousins and their colleagues and their mates will want to join in. At the very least, they'll want to join in. The best case scenario, perhaps, is that they will not want to join in, but neither will they dob in their colleagues or their cousins or their friends. And that's the point I don't understand. And that's where I honestly think, and have always thought, that this accusation of political correctness in some way stifling the investigations holds a little bit of truth. There's a fear of seeing what far-right people will do with this sort of reporting, and that's why it's always relevant to mention, and in my case I can mention my own school, and I can point out that none of the people who are furious about the grooming gangs in the north of England were furious about my school friends being raped at the age of 6 by men who claim to be monks. So that's where the fear of inciting racism comes in. You can see now, you know what I'm talking about, you might even be one of them. Somebody who cares more about a crime when it's committed by a brown person than they do about a crime when it's committed by a white person. But this kind of crime, specifically gang-based grooming of young people, is almost always committed by brown people. That's a very uncomfortable truth, but it is nonetheless a truth. And that's where we're going to pile in again this morning. If you come from a comparable background, again, a very unfashionable piece of information that most journalists won't bother sharing with you. Whenever these stories go live, whenever these court cases reach their fruition, whenever convictions are secured, organisations like NAPAC, the child abuse charity, see a huge uptick in the number of people contacting them who are from a British Asian background, girls who've been abused in their own home, they've been abused in their own families, but never collectively. That's always like the more, I hesitate to use the word traditional, but the lone offender. That will be the family-based offender. That will be the family friend or the uncle or the stepfather. And whenever these stories about Asian offenders reach the news, an awful lot of Asian victims, but not of grooming, of individual abuse, find the courage to come forward. So it's another reason why it's important to report these things with the prominence that has perhaps been missing in the past. The question then is this. Once you've got rid of all the extraneous detail, once you've acknowledged the absolutely unavoidable disproportional representation of British Asians in this kind of crime, but also in the interests of humanity, pointed out that, you know, there's a hell of a lot of paedophiles out there who are the same colour as you, whatever colour you are, then you look at this notion of cooperation, and that's where I feel sick. That's where I felt sick when we first started talking about these issues 6 or 7 years ago, and it's where I still feel sick today. Because what these stories prove is that men move in circles, professionally, socially, familiarly, where they are supremely confident that if they turned around and told the fella next to them that they were having illegal sex with a 14-year-old girl that they'd managed to successfully render addicted to Class A drugs, or consuming so much vodka before lunchtime that she doesn't even know what day it is, and they've got her holed up in some scummy little bedsit, and frankly, she'll do whatever I tell her to do. Do you want to go round there tonight, mate, with me? And that's the point at which I would almost lose responsibility for my actions if I witnessed this kind of conduct from people of any colour or background. It beggars belief that people could be presented with knowledge of that sort of crime being committed and sort of think, oh, I'd quite like to join in. That's the point, isn't it? This has got nothing to do with religion and everything to do with attitudes to women. Attitudes to women who are not, if you like, kept under lock and key, who are not seen as a chattel or a belonging, so that a woman who is immodest, a woman who is, think of 19th century England, think of, you know, in olden times a glimpse of stocking was looked on as something shocking, but all up and down the south bank of the River Thames you had brothels full of children. This notion of hypocrisy, the virgin and the whore, if you like. Here is my my woman, my daughter, my wife. We will protect her and keep her inviolate and clean and pure, and then all other women are just sort of temptresses, harlots, and borderline prostitutes. That's a worldview that men have perpetuated for generations, and it seems to still hold true in these groups. So give me a call and tell me how, in your understanding, and with the greatest of respect, if you've never met a Muslim, your understanding of how these issues unfold is probably less useful than others. How that specific scenario occurs. And I'd really love to talk to women from a similar background, because you will have a better insight into this and it's the extent of its horrors than almost anybody else does. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's that point there when someone has grown up in this country knowing that if they were to tell their colleague, their cousin, or their friend what they were doing, their colleague, their cousin, or their friend would not only approve, but would join in. And that's the point at which I think the rest of us lose our ability to understand. There was a case, wasn't there, one of those footballer cases which didn't turn out to have been a crime, where one of the footballers picked up a drunk girl and texted his mate to tell her that he was taking her back to a hotel room, and they could all sort of pile around and join in, which is still pretty gross. The girl involved wasn't underage, and perhaps it makes me sound a little bit naive or sheltered. I still think that kind of behaviour is disgusting and despicable, but it's not the same as this. This is actually about background. It always has been. Since the very first time we talked about it. Someone actually at one point told me the name of the region of Pakistan that seems to be particularly feudal still, particularly medieval still in its family relations. But the point remains, if you had these proclivities, these perversions, you would keep them secret. These men don't. That's the point that I want your help in better understanding. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. That's what I want to know. How can anybody in Britain in the 21st century have achieved adulthood secure in the knowledge that if they were to tell their friend, colleague or cousin that they were grooming, abusing and enslaving a 15-year-old girl, their cousin, their colleague, their friend would not only be supremely untroubled by the news, he'd also perhaps be keen to join in. Okay? So we're clear on what the question is. The more qualifications you have to answer it, in many ways the sorrier I will feel for you, but the more keen I am to talk to you. Hit those numbers now, you will get through. Also, just for people who are interested in detail, a lot of Sikh people will get angry when I use the word Asian. A lot of Pakistani people will get angry when I use the word Pakistani. A lot of Hindus get cross about the perception of brown people. They will usually be ostensibly of the Muslim faith, but by dint of the kind of crimes they're committing, they're clearly not by any stretch of the imagination devout or familiar with the terms of their own religion. It's a bit like claiming that Jimmy Savile was representative of Catholics. He was a papal knight, you know. He actually got a gong off the Pope. But if he was representative of Catholics, then I'm Jimmy Connors. The point here is simple. This is about people with a similar geographical and cultural background, and they indulge in a certain type of crime on a level that blows every other social grouping out of the water. If you don't ask why, you will never, ever solve the problem. It's 10:17. We look at the report into so-called child grooming gangs. We respond to the unsurprising statistic that 84% of those convicted have a British Pakistani background, and we ask a very specific question which is about cooperation and collusion. The notion that these men have arrived at adulthood secure in the knowledge that if they were to reveal their crimes to their colleagues and their cousins and their friends, their colleagues and their cousins and their friends will join in or want to. And that's the bit that we need to unpick today. Katie is in Portsmouth. Katie, what would you like to say?
Hello, thank you for having me on.
You're very welcome.
I'm a bit nervous.
Oh, don't be.
I have experience of grooming gangs in the 1960s myself, when I was a young girl. What I want to say is, it's not necessarily a Muslim problem. It's a problem of cultures where they hold their women very highly and see other girls and women outside that culture as less than human.
Yes.
My experience was with traveller boys, fairground boys.
Okay.
Where they And I know several other girls. We were treated appallingly by these boys. They got us drunk, and when we went to the fairground, and just shared us around.
And they would treat their wives and mothers.
They would keep their mothers and their wives just the same as Muslim families do. The girls are looked after and kept away from other men, but anybody outside that culture they felt were just subhuman to be used. And
we must stress there'll be plenty of people in the traveller community who are just as disgusted by what you describe as I am. But you're telling me about what you went through.
I'm talking about what I went through, and a couple of my friends did. We were just girls that went to a fairground, and we were just groomed.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
And this is the thing that you will understand and no one else will, which is, how did you not know you were being abused? How did you manage to persuade yourself that this was anything other than criminal activity?
Personally, I had quite an unhappy home life.
Yes.
And these boys being nice to me and giving me cider made me feel wanted.
Yes.
And it was quite a while before I realised, oh my God, what was happening to me.
How long was it? How long was it, Katie?
Probably about a year.
Okay. And by this point...
But then you couldn't get away. You'd be walking down the street and they'd come along in the cars and get you.
And how did you get away in the end?
I got pregnant and was put into my mother's home.
By one of them?
Mm-hmm.
And you managed to get some distance then between that world and... I got
some help from social workers and back into education and rebuilt my life.
I'm so glad. And when you hear these stories, you hear echoes.
It's been going on. It's just where cultures dehumanise people from other cultures. That's what I think. I've talked to other women that it's happened to, and they all agree with me, but nobody wants to speak out about it because it's an awful shame thing that we don't want to talk about.
And part of the reason for that is because other people find it so hard to understand, because you've ticked almost all of the boxes that appear in the J report about the vulnerability, the starved of affection, desperate for some... Also wanting to feel like a grown-up, believing that the original...
Yep,
groomer was somehow your boyfriend or somehow was looking after you and slowly introduces you to the concept of being abused by his friends. Can I ask how old you were when it all started?
About 13.
Oh, my Lord. And that's it, isn't it? Because there's a little bit of me, Katie, I'm not going to lie to you, because it would be disrespectful after you found the courage to call in. There's a little bit of me that doesn't want to talk about this because it upsets me so much. I've got a couple of little girls at home, and that's the problem as well. It's not just the fact that you might feel too ashamed to talk about it, or people like you who lack your courage. People don't want to listen because it's horrible.
No, it was as if I was the one doing something wrong.
And I think that perhaps is where the ethnicity element comes into it, so we can talk about the brown ones doing it because they're somehow not us.
That's right.
But we don't want to talk about the white ones doing it because then we'd have to recognise the fact that this has nothing to do with DNA or ethnicity and everything to do with the environment you've grown up in.
Yes.
How are you doing now?
Oh, well, I'm all right.
You sound it.
I'm shaking like anything at the moment because I don't want anybody to know about my past.
OK, well, don't worry about that. And that suggests to me that it's not something you've talked about often, or not something that perhaps people close to you now are aware of being in your past.
Definitely not.
And there's no words I can use now to convey to you how wrong it is that you should feel in any way culpable, responsible or guilty about what happened, because none of us can help what we feel inside ourselves, can we?
Mm-hmm.
But you do, still.
Of course. And when I hear this, I think, no, it's not Muslims. It's a cultural thing. It's all women, I say, are precious, not just the ones that you care for. You know, I mean, there are so many young, vulnerable girls out there who aren't being looked after at home that are going to be used in this way.
I still struggle with the... I mean, I know you've explained it, but personally, I still struggle with the thought, because I try and imagine it in my own world. I try to imagine one of my mates or someone I grew up with telling me that they've got a 13-year-old girl drunk upstairs, and would I like to go up? And I'd knock his lights out. Everyone I know, I think, would would react furiously, but it's almost like the kind of putting the women in the family on a pedestal, and then all other women are just fair game or prey, easy meat.
That's right, like a different species, dehumanised.
And that would appear to be more prevalent now in these British Asian communities and families than it is elsewhere in Britain. But you remind us that it's by no means unique. And Incorrigible FCA tweeted to remind us that in the 60s, the police wouldn't have wanted to investigate even if you had gone to see them, because the prevailing cultural norms were so different. It wouldn't even have been seen as a crime in some areas.
No.
Did you ever go to the authorities?
No. No.
Why not?
I was frightened, I think. It was a long time ago. I was just very scared and not in control of my life.
And again, that's the recurring theme. I'm so glad you called me. Has it been good for you?
Yes, it has. I've been listening to these conversations, and I've wanted to say this for so long.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Thank you for taking my call.
Oh, well, thank you for making it, and I look forward to talking to you again, possibly on less serious subjects next time, so that we can have a bit of a giggle together. But I know that took a lot of courage on your part, Katie, and I thank you for it. It's 28 minutes after 10. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It doesn't really explain... Well, it's a beginning of an understanding of why. The notion that you put women on a pedestal, you see them all as either somehow wives and mothers, or as well, effectively as harlots, prostitutes, whatever the word of the week is. But Katie nailed it, didn't she, when she talked about a sort of subhuman. Let's read a quick text, because I'm sure Katie's still listening, from Cindy, saying, what an amazing, brave and beautiful woman. What an incredible phone call. Thank you to Katie for that. And yet, you know, the conversation now inexorably, and quite rightly, will shift away from the traveller community that she described and back to the British Asian families at the heart of this report by Quilliam. More than any other subject we've ever covered on the programme, this is the one where people hear what they want to hear and see what they want to see. Our job is to keep it on the straight and narrow. This is a report about British Asian men being demonstrably and hugely disproportionately more likely to indulge in a certain type of crime against children. And that crime is the grooming and the gang-based exploitation of those children, and that crime depends upon one thing: the knowledge, not just the hope, but the knowledge that if you told your friends, your cousins or your colleagues what you were doing, they would not be disgusted. And that is what we're trying to unpick, and that is why Katie's call, I think, will stay with us all for a very long time. It's 10:30. We wade through the horrible business of child sex grooming gangs and the disproportionate number of British Asian men convicted of these crimes, hugely disproportionate, 84% according to some research undertaken by the think tank Quilliam. And focus on the one element of it that makes it different from other sex crimes, not the colour of the perpetrators, but the collusion, the fact that they can confidently turn to their cousin, their colleague or their friend, tell them what they're up to, and know that their cousin or their colleague or their friend will want to join in, which means that they have an identical worldview, and that worldview is clearly warped. Where does it come from? Bushra is in Nottingham. Bushra, what can you tell us?
Hi, James.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. I've just been, just listening to your show. Really interesting conversation. Just wanted to quickly sort of clarify that actually it's not just, it's not Asian girls that are protected within their homes and put on a pedestal. They're really not. It's within a certain background, but I mean, I've heard, and I have like a friend or two who've been sexually assaulted in their home by a relative, or they've been raped in their own home as a child. And it's pretty horrifying. So it's because those girls are easier to get to, if you know what I mean, because... Well, that's always... I mean, God, this is a horrible subject, isn't it? But that is...
Exactly.
I
had to coin the hideous phrase traditional paedophilia, or more commonplace paedophilia, will always be a lone offender attacking somebody known to him, quite possibly related to him. But that's not the discussion that prompted the suggestion that there's a kind of saint and sinner syndrome in play here. That's about the grooming, and the men doing the grooming would quite possibly hold the women in their families in a completely different regard to the young women that they're abusing and offending against?
Yes, yes and no. So in the sense, so it's in the sense that these girls, the girls in their homes, won't speak out about it at all because their families will not believe them. Even if they do believe them, because of the traditional hierarchical structure in some, and I'm saying this like, this is a major caveat. There are some Pakistani backgrounds which are probably affected by social class and education, where girls are not valued at all. Their voices are worthless, and all there's a lot of properties applied to them about honour and their worth. So they have no voice whatsoever. So when they do want to tell their mum or their dad that they've been raped by their uncle, mum might believe them, dad will want to believe them as well.
But this is again, I don't think we're at cross purposes, but this is this what you're talking about falls under the blanket description of abuse, and it's not specific to a certain background. Because very simply because ever since I've started doing this job, I've taken calls from adults like Katie, and adults describing the worst ones ever are when mum doesn't believe, and there's no uniting cultural background to those stories. They happen they happen in households that claim to be Catholic. They happen in black households, white households, brown households. That one-on-one abuse and the culture of skepticism and disbelief and the authority figures, it's why priests get away with it. What I don't understand is how a man who is grooming a 13 or a 14-year-old girl, not known to him, not related to him, can confidently tell his mate what he's up to, knowing that his mate will not just fail to be disgusted, but will probably be keen to join in. And that's what I don't get. And that's where I think there must be something in that saint and sinner syndrome.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about it. I'm just thinking that a lot of the grooming gangs are in areas where there's a concentration of a similar background. So obviously they're going to find, people in their family who hold the same views.
But you say obviously. And to me, it's not obvious. I've got in front of me stories from both of the schools I attended, from the ages of 7 to 13 and then from 13 to 18, where men were preying upon small boys on an industrial scale, but never knowing that they could turn to another monk or adult and say, I'm doing this. Do you see what I mean? That's the bit that I think confuses most.
I'm saying that they're within the same cultural community. So the background that they're coming from, and their families might live in a similar area.
Right.
And the background, like I said, it's the social class and the educational backgrounds will also be very similar. So you won't find this problem in British Pakistani educated homes.
No.
Where parents have gone through higher education and children have, and they understand Western values, or they respect Western secular values or Western Christian values, or Western democracy. So those you won't find that
modern Western, because they seem to be pretty close to Victorian morality. Actually, if you wanted to be historically relative for a moment, the notion that you could be a church-going, upstanding citizen while also surreptitiously visiting child brothels on the south bank of the Thames. That's only 150 years ago that half of London was at it. I get that. I'll read you something and you tell me you give it marks out of 10, all right?
Okay.
Hi, James. It's mainly people from the Mirpur region living in the north of England that commit these crimes. When they moved here from Pakistan, they were warned by their parents to keep away from white women as they're not part of their culture. This doesn't mean they were expecting crimes to be committed against white women. It has led men to disrespect and see these women as a piece of meat. Mohammed may have married an underage girl, which was commonplace in those days, but should never have been right at any time. But he wasn't known to go around in gangs of men, drinking and drugging underage girls, then passing them around for sex. That's not the Islam I know. In no mosque would this be considered okay. These men are far from many Muslims I know, but this problem exists. It's far from a racist thing to deal with this matter. Grooming is a culture thing. No name, please. Merry Christmas to all at LBC. That seems pretty solid.
Yeah, well...
No, we pick a hole if you want.
I can't, I really don't want to tar a community with that brush, because they have their own, like I said, they have social class issues and they have education issues.
But you have to. I think you have to tar the community. Because you've said it yourself, that they've come up with the same values, the same background. That's the point at which you know, everybody else gets lost, is the point at which he tells his mate what he's doing and his mate thinks it's a good idea.
I believe that if these values are from that specific community, then they definitely need to be addressed, they need to be talked about, they need to be rooted out, and there needs to be honest conversation within that community as well. I think in terms of it being linked to Islam, it's just ridiculous. I don't there's nothing to associate it, but what happens is that because many Muslim leaders, you know, quote unquote Muslim leaders, are from Asian backgrounds, or they're affected by, you know, they're influenced by their local community, they end up not putting enough pressure on that community to address misogyny, to address sexual abuse of women, of young girls, and then there's this whole attitude of placing, like I said, different values on different types of women. So, you know, a Muslim woman, you know, she's worth a lot more, and it's like, where are you coming from?
Yes.
It's every single woman. You're meant to value every single woman. It doesn't matter whether she's Muslim or not. So I think this is a massive problem that's coming from a particular community, and I think because I think there's a lack of emotional intelligence from those who are educated and who are possibly, you know, of a, you know, higher social strata, because they're living within, you know, like a concentrated community. They don't educate those who should be educated. They don't put enough focus.
Is it partly, I mean, partly through, I mean, shame is part of it. The Catholic Church's failure to deal. There's an abbot at a school just 2 miles away from where I live who was jailed last week for a catalogue of appalling crimes. There's a sort of sense of shame. It doesn't get properly addressed because it's like Pandora's box. You lift the lid on this and all of your certainties, all of your community cohesion could potentially collapse. So, I mean,
those conversations are incredibly important to have within the community. I mean, I'm part of a group of Muslim women who are trying to encourage and get, you know, we've got a collective of women, and we are talking about these issues, and we're trying to get other people to address misogyny within South Asian community. But it's incredibly difficult to root it out when it's so male-driven as well. And
so is the conversation often, so is the representation, the political or the moral representation, the religious leadership, the cultural leadership, it's all male.
Yeah, when Asian girls are unable to open up and say anything, it seems like that it's the Muslim community that's stifling them, whereas actually it's just that because most of the Muslims in this country are of a South Asian background, that's how it comes across. But I will tell you that there are, you know, you won't find this issue in the black Muslim community, you won't find it in the white Muslim community, you won't find this problem in Arab Muslim community, you won't find this problem in the Indian Muslim community. So, yes, you know, and that's what I'm saying about living in a concentrated area with the same community around you is a problem.
Yes.
Because then you're not able to meet different kinds of people, and this applies actually on the other, you know, on the other end of the spectrum to
racism. The best way to dilute racism is to send everybody to the same school. Yeah. So this, you know, if you're not meeting different people, you're not going to be able to understand. And I'm not saying that those people, those men are naive. They are in no way are they naive, but they know that they can get away with it because they're within the same community. Because we're judged by the moral context in which we live. All of us are, in a way. Very few people have the strength of will that's needed to have an individual moral compass, to make decisions about what is and what is not acceptable, to put principles ahead of pragmatism or self-interest. Most people will go with the flow, and if the flow in your community is that this kind of thing is acceptable, then standing up to it becomes... You're not going to see that actually there are other perspectives and other people who are willing to sort of catch you out and you know, dob you into the police. But because, like I said, they're working with people of a similar background, because I'm going to assume, like I said, it's the social strata as well. So what would be the first thing then? And I know you've kind of half answered this already, but if you could get 100 of these clowns in a room, what would be the first way? Because I'm a big fan of penny drop moments, as you know if you listen to the programme. Just finding these little keys that unlock, start a very long and difficult process. I mean, because you could say, imagine if another man was doing this to your wife or your daughter or your mother, or something like that. Yeah, I hate it when people say, oh, you know, imagine if it was done to your wife and your daughter.
it's like that's the only way you can accept that a woman is valuable.
Yeah.
So I mean,
what
I would like to understand, I would ask them questions. I would ask them, where are you coming from? What do you understand about women?
Yes.
Are they just sex objects to you? Because clearly,
and this is what Quilliam have done, and the answer in a lot of cases is yes. I mean, that is exactly where the hymn sheet from which they sing.
Yeah. So that's the thing. And because, like I said, they're meeting with each other, they're not meeting with anyone else. So the values they apply to women are all very similar. And because young girls who are drunk, who are out late at night, it's not their fault that they are out late at night. It's not their fault they're getting raped or that they're getting caught up in grooming gangs. It's the predators. And because they see that, this is it's.
And you know what? I just heard in your voice then that I mean, they're looking on the same graph, as it were, at a much lower end of the same graph. If you've got the grooming offences at the high end, it's the perception of the victims that you're leading me to now. And it sounds like a turbocharged version of she was asking for it, or she shouldn't have gone out dressed like that, or what do you expect if you drink that much? And you find an awful lot of people in the media making those arguments against women when they've been abused by celebrities or footballers or children's television presenters or DJ. Oh, they're just after compensate. Look at the state of her skirt. Look what she was wearing. Look how drunk she was. And that's the same mindset that these men have when they have someone in the back of their taxi in a short skirt who's drunk, and they think, well, that's it then. She's asking for it.
If it's like you said, if the media are coming out with this kind of rubbish,
yes,
what do we expect from men like that? Who already have such a disgusting view of men. Of women.
You open up your newspaper and you've got a columnist saying to you, if a drunk girl with a tiny skirt is raped, then frankly she's only got herself to blame. How do you then break through to these men and say, no, of course that's just disgusting?
But then again, why they
I'm late for the break.
Taking their morality. They should not be taking their morality from the media.
Then we're back to the moral compass and the context of a community, or those few brave souls who endeavour to live by their own moral code. Bushra, that was a spectacularly good call. Would you drop me an email? Let me know a little bit more about the group that you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll let you know.
Thank you very much.
I don't know your email address.
James at lbc.co.uk. It doesn't get much easier than that.
Brilliant.
All right.
Okay, I will do.
Thank you. And there's some food for thought. What worldview do these men have? These scumbags have same worldview as the kind of people who write newspaper columns saying, well, if you go out at the age of 15 with your knickers around your ankles and you fall into the back of a taxi, absolutely plastered, what's going to happen? Men will be men. Astonishing calls today, and that's partly why we haven't taken many, because these aren't the kind of issues that lend themselves to quick sound bites or sort of staged fights. Katie describing her experiences of being groomed, and then Bushra talking about her understanding of how it can grow up and be fostered in certain communities. This is very strong from James, who's in Worthing. He says the right-wing commentary around this issue is troubling because it seems to be about Muslims attacking, quotes, our, end quotes, white girls, which suggests once again that the two sides are closer on their attitude to women than either would like to admit. Yeah, you're right. I'd never thought of it like that. You show me a story of a young girl being abused, and my sympathy and concern for her is not going to be affected one iota by the ethnicity or the professed religion or the background of the person that's done it. The sympathy for that girl is complete. But I have never understood the kind of people that argue if an intoxicated young woman finds herself in the clutches of a predatory male, then she somehow has herself to blame. I've never understood that, but that's what the grooming gangs believe, and that's what some people who get paid quite a lot of money to comment on the news in this country apparently believe as well. You've had it from high court judges, haven't you? How many times have we sat here and struggled with that simple suggestion that women should somehow dress according to their fear of being abused? It's acknowledging tacitly that men will abuse women, given half the chance. And yet these stories, always and inevitably, don't really focus on the victims, but they focus on the ethnicity of the perpetrators. I love your show, but I'm incensed listening today to hear people say that the abuse is confined to the poor and uneducated. It's wrong to make such generalisations, as it's well known the abuse is carried out by all types, such as politicians, teachers and people holding high positions in different religious spheres. It's dangerous to deflect understanding of what abuse is to a certain type. It can happen anywhere and by anyone. Joe, you're absolutely right, but we are specifically talking about grooming gangs consisting disproportionately, I mean, in terms of convictions, 84% men of British Pakistani origin, and that's very much what Bushra was addressing, her own experiences, if you will, her own knowledge, and that is where I would disagree with you, but I'm sorry that I didn't make that clear enough, because there's no desire on my part during this conversation to add to the ignorance that already dominates the issue. Nabila is now. Where are we going next? Tariq's been waiting longer, I think. Tariq's in Hammersmith. Tariq, what would you like to say?
I'd like to say that you're asking why these men so easily tell their colleagues that they're dealing in such crimes. Now, I believe it's because they already know the personalities of their social peers. So they're unlikely to tell a cousin or a colleague who they know are straight, decent individuals.
Okay.
And these people work in nighttime industries such as taxi industry or fast food industry. And they have a lot of free time. So obviously they're socialising like men do, talking about various topics. So they come to know what people are like and who will share similar interests.
And they wouldn't, I mean, in the strictest sense of the words, this isn't. They wouldn't see this as child abuse. They would. We saw this in the case of. I have to be so careful with the legal things because of appeals and convictions being quashed and overturned. But the Sunderland footballer who was sent to jail for grooming a 15-year-old girl, the number of people that were queuing up to describe the extent of her physical development, the kind of clothes that she wore, as if it somehow wasn't a crime. And they would be the same people who profess to be mightily outraged by these sort of stories, but oddly flick the dial a tiny bit, and they're adding to the argument that 14 or 15-year-old girls can be provocative, can be fair game, can be responsible for or even asking for what happens to them. And yeah, you might be onto something there, because you would know which of your social circle had more dubious morals than you did, wouldn't you?
Of course, because I've heard you previously ask a question a few months ago, asking about yourself. I mean, if you were at work and your colleague or your friend asked you such thing, how shocked you'd be. But that wouldn't really happen in your circle, in your social class, in your work industry. But if you're working, say, I don't know, like a taxi cab with these guys, they'll get to know you with the tough guy you are. I mean, I don't think these men are stupid. I don't think they will openly go and tell every other guy that this is what we're doing, come and join us. They know that they have a perfectly wide social circle amongst their community, and that's how they operate. I mean, I believe they operate very similar to, say, so-called white online grooming gangs.
Yes.
These gangs seek out similar people with similar interests. And these people are exactly the same. They seek people with similar interests, they socialise in their circles, and they do the illegal activities in these circles.
And it's a misogyny that's at the heart of this. The worst kind of misogyny, which affords status to women according to how well they fit into a code of conduct defined by men, or defined often by religion or by social norms. So we're back, aren't we? We're back to the High Court judges saying that girl asked for it. And if you just take that to its logical conclusion, then a drunk girl in the back of a taxi is easy pickings for everybody.
I can tell you, this misogyny has nothing to do with the Pakistan community, the Muslim community. This misogyny exists in society. So this whole lad culture we have, lad banter, lad culture. Except
that, I'm afraid, the 84% figure flies in. We're going to run out of time, so forgive me if you were making a more nuanced point than I'm responding to. But the 84% figure means that this specific gang-based grooming does have a massive disproportionate representation among British Asians, British Pakistani Asians. But, you know, every word I use somebody objects to. Even Pakistani sometimes says it's not Pakistan. Please don't tar us all with the same brush. It's specific to Mirpur. We'll be doing it village by village next. I'm going to take a couple more calls on this, not least because the quality of contributors so far has been astonishingly high, which quite a few of you have pointed out and thanked the women mostly responsible for that. I feel my understanding is perhaps increasing, although I was already clear on the kind of feudal medieval values imported from rural Pakistan and never properly excised from communities that have grown up in the Midlands and the north of England. And then you look for you have to as well, because unfortunately the debate is driven largely by that mindset that's desperately looking around for proof that all brown people or all Muslims are terrorists or paedophiles or child abusers, and they're the people who hate it. when I point out, I can't remember the fella's name, I should have checked during the news, that football player who was grooming an underage girl, and the underage girl got all the abuse online. So they're perfectly happy, these people, the chomping mob, if you will, are perfectly happy to accept that an underage girl can be responsible for her own abuse when it's a footballer doing it, doing the grooming, but not when it's a brown taxi driver. Almost as if the colour of the skin has more to do with the response to the offence than the gravity of the offence or the concerns of the victim. 6 minutes after 11 is the time. I will take a couple more calls on this because you've really stepped up to the plate today. A few of you asking about the Grenfell Tower inquiry story and whether we'll be covering it much today. We won't be covering it much today because we're going down there again on Thursday. We're going to do the whole show from Grenfell Tower on Thursday, even though the memorial service itself will be taking place at St Paul's. An awful lot of people affected by that tragedy will not be at St Paul's, so we will be in the midst of their community. 7 minutes after 11 is the time. Nabila is in Maidenhead. Nabila, what would you like to say?
Hi, first-time caller to LBC.
You're very welcome.
I couldn't resist myself when you for this topic. I think, first of all, just let me quickly give you my background to give you the context. I came to UK about 5 years ago. I'm from a Bangladeshi background. I'm not British, and I'm a Muslim. So I think, first of all, thank you very much for raising these kinds of topics, because my observation in the past few years is the British, the media, or the responsible, lots like you're so scared of being labeled as racist or, crossing that fine line. Is things like this does not really come up. And actually, as Asians, as Muslims, we want these topics to be discussed so that this will actually help any kind of, mass stereotyping.
Yes, of course. Well, I mean, that's the problem, isn't it, with the label? And people say, why are you saying Asian? It's nothing to do with Hindus, it's all the Muslims. And then, of course, the Muslims will say, well, hang on a minute, this is confined to a relatively small part of our community. There's billions of Muslims in the world, and you can count the grooming gangs. So that's the problem. Everybody, I mean, as a man, if you take it to its logical conclusion, you could say, well, look, just because they're all men doesn't mean you should mention that they're men. I'm a man, and I feel somehow impugned by the description. No one's ever going to be happy with the description. We're going to have to live with that, Nabila.
Exactly. But I think certain things are matter of fact rather than matter of opinion.
Yes.
And you see 84% of them are coming from a certain background.
Bingo. Can't ignore it.
Exactly. You can't just... these things need to be talked about so that these kind of viruses are removed from the society. Now, your point on... and I completely agree with your last caller, which tells this is not about religion, this is about the community. One thing... it's very good, would be good to point out at this point is that if we go backwards about 46 years from now, there was a war between East and West Pakistan, as a result of which war, in 1971, Bangladesh was born.
Yes.
Now, why am I saying that? Is because that was one of the few times in history where rape was used as a weapon of war by the Pakistani army. Yeah?
Yes, well, I think it's been used a lot, actually, over history. I mean, it's certainly, even if you go back to ancient Rome and the rape of the Sabine women, although the literal word means steal. We've seen it happen in Rwanda, we've seen it happen in Kosovo, we saw it happen in the Second World War, but anyway, I'm splitting hairs, I apologise.
And in many of the cases, not about the medieval society, but in recent wars, in most of them, you'll actually see the perpetrators at some point in the history apologizing for what they have done.
Yes.
Except for this, or one of the few cases is like the wars of Pakistan, where they never apologized. The point over here is that what was told to the Pakistani army back then is they are lesser of Muslims or their Hindu background, and that's why it's okay to rape those women. Yeah,
yes.
And you will see many children, illegitimate children, as a result of that in Bangladesh. So the point over here is that one cannot just simply ignore the fact that what is it about that particular community or that particular
worldview
of the world? Yeah, a view towards. Sorry.
Well, it's a worldview, isn't it?
Yeah,
because we're looking for the words, the cultural background, the ethnicity. Some people are keen to impart a religion, but it's a worldview that these people have, a shared worldview.
Exactly. And absolutely, and anyone who is lesser of a woman in terms of lesser of a Pakistani or lesser of a Muslim in their eyes is okay to violate. And when people came, and when people from those backgrounds came over here, and it's by no means, I don't want to stereotype in a way that everyone is equally.
Of course not.
I have friends from those Pakistani backgrounds as well. But people who did not integrate and who were told that white women are, it's okay to violate them in a way. And, because they simply don't integrate, that view has continued. They live here, they get all the benefits of the society, and if you really deep down, you probably see many of them are actually living in benefits, in taxpayers' money, and they absolutely abhor the British society. I'll give you one very quick example. My husband went for Eid prayers in local Maidenhead. Yeah, we're not talking about north of the UK. It's just west of London.
Yes.
The imam over there, and majority of them are over there is within from Pakistani background. All they talked about during the sermon, during the Eid prayer, is how the children of Muslim, so-called Muslim community are being impacted by the British value. Here, British value is seen as a negative thing. And
what do they mean by British values? Because they mean that.
Not really.
They mean liberalism, tolerance, diversity, equality. Because there's plenty of British people who've got a massive problem with those sort of British values as well.
I don't really know what they really mean by British value, to be honest, because as you can
probably not. Well, no, because I would say British values is that a woman can wear what she wants and drink what she wants and never be responsible for rape. But then I'll open up the best-selling newspapers in the country and they'll be punting British values and teaching the exact opposite. Yeah. It's people. These men, whether they're editing newspapers or preaching in mosques, they only thrive if we feel that we are profoundly different from each other, don't they? They only thrive if it's division. So when they say British values, someone else says Muslim men grooming white girls. It only works, this world view, which is shared on all extremities. It only works if you fundamentally punt the notion that we are inherently different from each other. We're just not the same species somehow. That's how it works.
Absolutely agree. And that is why integration is so important. And I think integration is something that needs to come from both sides. In a society where you're integrated to, of course, society needs to keep an open arm. And personally, I've never felt any less of anything. I've never had any racial abuse in the past 6 years I've been living in this country. So I think the people who are trying to come here and make a better living need to do their part to integrate into the society.
It just gets harder and harder and harder, though, doesn't it? Because, you see, I can tell you without even double-checking that there'll be plenty of tweets coming in trying to do the opposite of that. I mean, here you go. Here's one from George. James is a sick man in total denial. Read the Islamic connections to grooming. Non-Muslims treated as kuffar. What a disservice he does to the victim. Sick, willful denial and conflation of subjects. How does he sleep at night? So that fella thinks that you believe him to be cattle. So how the hell are you ever going to feel that you want to go out and integrate with somebody like him? Do you see what I mean? The rhetoric from the extremes on both sides, whether it's the imam saying British values are bad, or a muppet like George saying that all Muslims think all non-Muslims are beneath them, the integration moves further away, not nearer, because they need us to be divided to keep their power.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are we going to do, Nabila? How are we going to fix it, you and me, right now, before the travel news?
Well, again, it comes back to integration, but one step at a time. You don't need to go out and, to start suddenly doing clubbing or things like that just to feel integrated, because it just go to different schools. Just stop living just within your own community.
And then also talk to each other and listen to people like me talking to people like you, or women like Bushra, and recognising that we come from the same planet and we share the same dreams, and the people who would rather we were biting chunks out of each other exist in all of our communities.
Absolutely. And do talk about it. I mean, have us part of that conversation from different walks of the society.
Yes, well, that is absolutely crucial. I am genuinely up against the break now, Nabila. I enjoyed that conversation enormously.